Okay. Good morning. I want to begin my talk today with the tale of two junior girls who may represent many of the low-income minority students sitting in your classroom. Okay. Student A is Latina. Both of these girls, by the way, are free lunch. Student A is a Latina girl, an average BC student, who generally stays out of trouble other than the occasional detention for coming to school late too many times. She'll sit in your class. She'll do most of the work that you assign. She'll accept her B- C+ in your classroom setting, and she will actively work not to have any direct conflict with you as a teacher. Student B, on the other hand, is an African American female, also a junior, best friends with student A. She is a lower B- C- student who struggles in math and science and any class that she feels the teacher is singling her out or dismissing her. She struggles with interactions with administrators. Since her 3 years in high school, she's been sent to the office and referred to the office several times for, quote, verbal aggression, which in layman's terms means that she vocally speaks out loudly and oftentimes with colorful language. This year, she's had some issues with one teacher who has called administrators on her or sent her to the office numerous times for her refusal to discuss with the teacher why she didn't do her homework. Okay? And so she's most vocal in classes where she doesn't understand the information and she feels that the teacher is dismissing her. What I want you to consider is which of these two students would you consider to be the ideal student to have in your classroom? Which one would be the nicest one to have? Okay. Please note, both of these individuals have passed the ECA English test in Indiana. However, only student A, the Latina, has passed the algebra ECA on her third attempt. The other student is still working to try to pass that test. Okay? So I want you to think about these students as I move through my speech. During my 18 years of teaching, I've encountered and had conflicts with all sorts of students. My first year of teaching, I had the young lady who came unglued because I refused to let her talk about pole dancing in her career speech. I had the white middle class honor student who got upset because I gave her a B+ honor speech, and she felt adamantly that she deserved the A. I had the African American girl my first year who didn't seem to understand why she should keep quiet every time I talked and gave notes or gave directions. She had to respond to everything I said. And then there were my group of 6 African American girls last year in my lab class who never seemed to understand that the proper way of behaving in a classroom is to sit quietly and not yell your opinions across the classroom floor. So in all 4 of these instances, I had to deal with the confrontation and the conflict that came about naturally. And one of them, I handled it with ease. One, I figured out what was going on kind of by accident. And in the other 2 examples, I left feeling like I had missed an opportunity to connect with these students. And over my 18 years of teaching, I've come to realize that in those 2 missed opportunities, that missed opportunity was less because of those students' intentions and choices, and more because of my unwillingness to understand where they came from and to figure out their culture. So that brings me today as to why I'm here. Those failed interactions is the reason that I'm giving this talk and discussing what we as middle-class teachers can do to better handle the natural conflicts that come about when we approach students of lower social class and minority students. And there are 3 questions that I'm hoping to address by the end of my speech. 1, what's the big deal? Why should we do it? Secondly, why should we change as teachers? And why shouldn't the students have some kind of accountability? And then finally, what can we do as teachers to actually do anything when we're interacting with students of low social income and minorities as well? So let's begin with question 1. What's the big deal? One of the many challenges we face as educators is communicating and relating to all of our students, regardless of the diverse backgrounds that they come from. It's a daunting task. And if we truly desire to impact all of our students' lives and their academic futures, we need to consider what the research tells us. For example, consider the following facts. 1, research proves in multiple studies that teachers come in to their classroom with preconceived idea that low-income and minority students are naturally going to perform at a lower academic level than our white, middle-class, and upper-class students. So we already have judgments on students based on racial stereotypes and social class stereotypes, even before they enter our classroom. Secondly, low-income and minority students often refuse or hesitate to participate in class discussions, not because they're lazy or because they don't care, but because they lack the academic language that middle-class students already come into play, and they feel inferior and they don't want to seem stupid in front of their friends. Research has shown this. As Professor Christopher Emden of Columbia University's Teacher College said in his book, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, these students come in understanding that there are only two ways to get a teacher's attention. First, to be silent and behaved, or to be vocal and loud and verbal, which will naturally get them into trouble. Remember my two girls at the beginning of the speech? Student A chose to be silent, even when it affected her grade. Student B chose to be vocal and voice her frustrations, even though she knew and still knows that it's probably going to get her sent to the office. Okay, so all of these statistics, okay, bring us to situations where low-income minority students walk into our classroom expecting us to have low expectations for them. Why should they bother to try if the teacher already assumes they're not going to do well? And it naturally leads to the conflict that they feel of either giving up and staying quiet, silencing oftentimes their own identities, or presenting their opinions and getting into a major conflict and confrontation with the teacher. We need to think about that. That leads me to my second point, or second question. Why should we as teachers be the one who change? I mean, after all, these students are going to need to learn to work within the middle class system if they want to be successful, right? Consider these two aspects. One, researchers have shown continuously that teacher expectations have a more powerful influence on African American students than they do on white students. Let me repeat that. Multiple studies that I have read and looked at have shown that our interactions and our expectations of African American students directly impact them more than our expectations of our white students. That goes the same, I believe, for low-income students as well. So what we believe before those students even come into our classroom has a profound impact on the results that we are going to see. Secondly, sociologist Annette Leroux, in her expansive study of social class, has found that working and low-class parents tend to not advocate for their students' academic abilities and defer to the teachers. Why? Again, not because they don't care, according to Annette Leroux, but because they believe the teachers are experts. They do the same with doctors and lawyers, etc. And so they don't feel it's their place to question the teacher, where middle class and higher class parents believe it's their right and their duty to step in and advocate for their students' academic achievement, regardless of how the teacher feels. In both cases, we as teachers face different conflicts because of our middle class values and our students' diverse backgrounds. In both cases, we get frustrated because we can't seem to get the students to do what we want them to do or approach the parents in the way that we feel they should be approached. So let's return to my two girls again from the beginning of the speech. I interviewed both of them for this research assignment and asked what their kind of level of conflict with teachers were. Here's their response. Student A, the Latina girl, told me that she accepts her place and doesn't really rock the boat. Why? Because she, as she says, goes with the flow, because she knows that teachers oftentimes are in, quote, teacher mode, as opposed to people mode. What does that mean? Well, in clarifying, she said that she feels like many of her teachers approach the situation like, I'm the teacher, this is the way you need to figure it out to do it. I present you the content, it's not my job to interact with you. And she feels like she's less of a person in that way. However, she wants to avoid that conflict because she doesn't want to get sent to the office. And so she, in her own words, when I asked her, says she will sit back and accept the C+ or C on a test or an assignment simply because that's the way it is, even though she knows going into it that she doesn't understand all of the information. Student B, the African American girl, on the other hand, says that she feels as frustrated because she walks into a classroom and she feels as though the teacher isn't going to help her because it should just be her doing it. In fact, she said she even had a teacher last year who told her, well, everybody else in the class is figuring it out, so you're just going to have to figure it out. I'm not waiting for you, and proceeded to move on with the lesson. She didn't want to accept that. And oftentimes the only way she knew how to voice her frustration was loudly and vocally, which got her sent to the office. Or in one instance this year, an administrator to come to her to talk to her about it. So in her own words, she felt like she had done something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was understand the information so she could get a good score on the test. So consider that, okay? So I'm guessing at this point in time, so that the student that you would assume would probably be the preferred one would be student A. If I were choosing, that's the one I would pick, probably, initially. But consider the choices that they both make. Student A is willing to sit back and be the quiet, polite, well-behaved student at the expense of her grade. Student B wants to get the better grade and isn't going to settle for letting the teacher get by. Which of those two is advocating best for their academic achievement? That's what we need to consider. I believe that different approaches to the conflict, or the lack of conflict, could potentially change both students' academic achievement. Which brings me to my third and final question. What can we do as teachers? Clearly, student B is still going to struggle in math and science. It's just something that she's not good at, and she acknowledges that. Okay, there will be days when her frustration at feeling dumb and inadequate is going to boil over, and she's going to have difficulty understanding how to adequately deal with that because of her background. Okay, however, I can promise you that when she feels as though the teacher understands her viewpoint and tries to understand what she's feeling, she will do everything in her power to help you out and to work with you and to allow you to work with her. So I propose that we make a few conscious choices as teachers in the way that we approach our classes next year or in years future to see what we can do, okay, to help our interactions and our relationships with our low-income students and our students of color. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to get rid of every single conflict, because conflict is natural, and we are dealing with teenagers who are still trying to find who they are and where they fit in the world. However, I believe there are 3 initial steps that we can take. Step 1, we have to acknowledge that all of us, myself included, walk into our classrooms with preconceived notions and judgments. It's difficult and oftentimes painful, but we need to realize that often we're our own enemy in dealing with these students. Okay, and which leads us to step 2. We need to take a suggestion from the authors of difficult conversations, and we should approach any interaction, and especially conflicts and confrontations that we have to have with these students, or any student for that matter, by first trying to figure out what their viewpoint is and to understand where they're coming from. Think about approaching student B from a different aspect and a different viewpoint, where you consider she really just wants to understand the material, and she's frustrated and doesn't know how to release that frustration in a positive manner because she doesn't understand the material, and all she really wants to do is pass the test and feel like she's smart and successful. And then finally, step 3. Here's sort of the big idea. We need to reflect on the ways that we can change our approach and even potentially our entire class structure and environment to allow our low social class and minority students to feel welcome and to feel like they have an opportunity to participate and that they bring some strengths to the table as well. Okay, so for example, up until last year when I taught the English lab class, I would often have some of my lower income students and minority students struggle with having to use Times New Roman for their font for writing papers. They just could not understand why anybody would want to use the, in their words, ugliest font ever. And I would have incredible fights with them. And after a year or two, I began to actually ask myself from their viewpoint, what does it really matter that it's a Times New Roman font? Other than, well, we know that college professors are going to have to do it. Okay, but at that point in time, there are some college profs that want something else as well. And so I began to realize that for them, that design was actually a part of their identity. And they would spend, for what I would consider way too much time, trying to figure out what font they were doing. Okay, but in their mind, that was as important as the content that they presented it to me. So I remember allowing them to use that for one assignment. And the information and the content that I got with that assignment, for whatever reason, was actually better. Because once they could feel like they could express who they are and their identity, then they could get down to the task of content. So that was a small change, perhaps, but for those students, they felt like they had some ownership in what they were presenting. I want to end, finally, with the story of the African-American girl, who always seemed to have to respond to everything I said from my introduction. It was in my first year of teaching, and I would get frustrated because she repeated everything I would say. And she would make her little side, what I considered side disrespectful comments to me. And she was frustrating me because I felt like she was disrupting the entire class. So I asked the veteran teacher what I should do and was told, well, you need to talk to her about it and ask her why she's doing that, which seemed kind of silly to me. So one day I got really frustrated and I'd finally had enough, and I sent her into the hallway. And I went out to talk to her, and I was ready with my standard Stutzman gruff speech of, look, Erishay, you're being disrespectful and I'm kind of tired of it. Except I got about halfway through that sentence and tears welled up in her eyes, and she started crying, which threw me off because I wasn't expecting that response from her. And I said, Erishay, do you not understand what you're doing? And her response to me was, Mr. Stutzman, you're my favorite teacher. And I just wanted to let you know that I understood where you were coming from and that I was getting what you were saying. And then it hit me. For her, my class was church. She was responding to me the way that she had been taught to respond to her pastor and to her preacher, with the call and response effect, and to let me know. And when I thought about it, she was right. Everything she said was never like snide comments. It was like, oh, I got that. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, that's a good idea. And after thinking about that, I realized she was actually giving me mad props, as opposed to, trying to disrupt the class. And I felt a little honored and then kind of silly and foolish for thinking that she would be disruptive. So we came to a compromise to understand that I would allow her to do some of that when I gave directions, but she would stay quiet so she wouldn't bother other students while they had to take notes. And she became one of my top students in the class. So a simple stepping back for me and understanding her context and her point of view helped me make a connection that otherwise I would not have done. So I simply think that we as a staff and as a community of teachers need to take into consideration and begin to think about what are some ways that we can improve our relations with our low-income and minority students. Thank you very much.